So it is 4 o'clock and I think we should start. My name, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Bea Lewkowicz and I'm the director of the AJR Refugee Voices Archive. On behalf of the archive and the Association of Jewish Refugees, I'd like to welcome you to this year's Refugee Voices Holocaust Memorial Day event, which we entitled Remembering Together. This event is being recorded, so please, if you don't want to see yourself in the recording, just switch off your video. We are going to have speakers at the beginning, and hopefully there will be a chance to ask questions either in the chat or if you raise your hand later on. The theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is One Day. And we're honored today to talk to Kurt Marx, Larissa Schmitz, and his granddaughter, Johanna Marx, on the 83rd anniversary of Kurt's arrival in Britain. Kurt came to the UK on the 18th of January, 1939, as a 13-year-old boy on a Kindertransport from Cologne. That day represents a day of rescue, but also a day of painful separation, something often forgotten in popular representation of the Kindertransport. The other theme which this day touches on is the effort of individuals who made the Kindertransport possible. In Kurt's case, it's the story of the headmaster of the Jaffna school in Cologne, Dr. Klebansky, who prepared the pupils for immigration and facilitated that 5 Jaffna classes could come to the UK. And Kurt was in one of the 5 classes, in fact, in the first one to arrive here. And I'm very happy to say that I think his niece is joining us, and perhaps we can hear from her a bit later. The theme of remembering together is a theme which is very close to my heart, as it is very much what an oral history archive does. First, in the actual interview, the interviewer helps the interviewee to remember, and the interview is an outcome of the conversation between interviewer and interviewee. And then later, when we show films and excerpts from the interviews, sometimes many years after the actual interview, and the story of each person is being heard and remembered together and in many different contexts. Kurt's interview, for example, was part of a Spiegel television documentary last year on the Kindertransport and watched by thousands of people online. His story will also be featured shortly in an exhibition in the Jewish Museum of Dorsten in Westphalia. Kurt is one of the 70 former Kinder who we interviewed for the Refugee Voices Archive, and his interview from 2019 is part of a collection of the 260 Refugee Voices interviews. It was a very memorable interview for me personally, as I grew up in Cologne, not far from where Kurt had lived, as a daughter of 2 Polish Slovak survivors who had no connection to the pre-war life in Cologne. And I should add, at the time when I lived in Cologne, this was until 1989, there were only a few public references to Jewish life in the city. This has changed today, and maybe we can discuss that. The interview, Kurt's interview, which took place on 2 days, is one of our longest interviews in the archive. It's almost 7 hours long. And to find out more, please, about Kurt's or any other interviews, visit our website, ajrrefugeevoices.org.uk. Kurt received the British Empire Medal in 2020 and was awarded the Cross of the Order of Merit by the Federal Republic of Germany in 2021 in recognition for his services to Holocaust education. So I'm very pleased that we will start our proceedings today with a few words from Dr. Susanne Frane, who is the head of the Department for Culture and Education at the German Embassy in London. Following her presentation, I will introduce Kurt and the other speakers, the Cologne-based journalist Larissa Schmitz and his granddaughter Johanna Marx. So thank you, Dr. Frane, for joining us today. Dr. Susanne Frane took up the position as a head of culture and education at the German Embassy in London in August 21, after joining the German Embassy in 2013. She holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Erlangen. So over to you, Dr. Frane.
Thank you very much, Bea, for these kind words of welcome. Bea, Mr. Marx, Frau Schmitz, Johanna Marx, ladies and gentlemen, I am deeply honored and humbled to have been invited to join you on this most somber and important occasion to remember together with you the victims of the Shoah. Holocaust Memorial Day not only bears witness to the unspeakable crimes committed against 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, it is also a powerful call to all of us to look back to the past in order to be able to see the future more clearly. Allow me to begin by paying tribute to the inspirational and unwavering dedication of the Association of Jewish Refugees, its members and friends, as well as the AJR Refugee Voices Archive and its contributors, to keeping the lessons of the Shoah alive by capturing the important legacy of survivors, eyewitnesses, and the second and third generations for posterity. I feel deeply moved that Mr. Marx has kindly agreed to share with us, together with his granddaughter Johanna and Larissa Schmitz, his powerful memories on this very special occasion. His story stands for so many stories of lives not lived, of parents having to part with their children to send them to safety on the Kindertransport, of rescued children growing up in a foreign country without their parents, of surviving horrors we can barely imagine. We are immensely fortunate and grateful that Holocaust survivors like you, dear Mr. Marx, are able to find the strength and determination to reach out to the younger generations so that they and we can learn from the atrocities of the past in order to build a peaceful future. The Nazi regime showed us that genocide was allowed to happen not just through the choices made by the people who perpetrated it, but also through the choices made by those who failed to stop the perpetrators. To speak up against injustice, anti-Semitism, and hate crimes, not just today, but every single day, and to fulfill this duty that is borne by each and every one of us, this must be and must always remain our lesson. Choosing to remain a bystander and look away will fertilize the hatred that has already found its way into the heart of our society. The dark road towards the moral abyss of the Shoah started with little things, tolerating small acts of hatred such as casual stereotyping. But the little things, unchecked and unchallenged, took root and grew into everyday monstrosities of unbearable scale. At a time when populism, aggressive nationalism, and anti-Semitism are on the rise, when racism, social exclusion, and violence are creeping back into our societies in Europe, but also in other parts of the globe, as we have seen in Texas recently, Holocaust Memorial Day must be far more than commemoration. It must be a spur to action. It must remind us that our liberal values, which we sometimes take for granted, are fragile and precious. They need to be honored, earned, and defended. The time has come once again, accelerated during and by the COVID pandemic, to face down demagogues and populists with simplistic slogans and fake solutions, to counter every unacceptable tweet, every form of verbal and physical abuse, every further deterioration of our level of discourse with each other. The fight against anti-Semitism in words and deeds must take place on all levels across government, legal institutions, the security forces, but first and foremost across communities. We all are the most powerful weapon against this threat, and we need to lead by example. There already exist truly commendable acts of civil engagement that bring us all together under the banner of solidarity and empathy. And one example will be at the heart of today's event, Stolpersteine. I remember when more and more Stolpersteine became an essential and defining part of the city landscape of my hometown, Nuremberg. Brass plaques that commemorate the citizens of Nuremberg who were deported and murdered by the Nazis. Thanks to these stumbling stones, the fate of individuals has entered the consciousness and subconsciousness of citizens in over 600 other towns in Germany. Every name, every life story frees the victims of Nazi persecution from anonymity. Every Stolperstein posthumously defies the Nazi regime that wanted to rob people of their humanity and degrade them to mere numbers. Over the last couple of years, we have witnessed with wonder and deep humility that more and more Jews want to explore Germany as a country, as a culture, and even as a new home. The Jewish community in Germany now counts around 100,000 members, making it the 8th largest in the world. At the embassy in London, we also observe with gratitude the growing number of UK citizens with Jewish roots who are taking the huge step of reclaiming their German identity. This is a gift to Germany that we will cherish and hold dear. To protect this trust that you have placed in us, Germany will continue to keep alive the memory of the crimes committed by the Nazi regime, and we will continue to honor its victims. This is and will remain our burden, our responsibility, and our duty for the dead and for the living. Germany will also continue to strive to protect and preserve human rights, freedom, the rule of law, and pluralism, and combat anti-Semitism in all its forms. We are truly grateful for the important work of the AJR and the AJR Refugee Voices archives here in the UK and beyond, and wish them and their network of contributors, volunteers, and supporters every further success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susanne, for your very important words, specifically in the light of the horrific events in Texas last weekend. Now, we're going to proceed now, and I'm going to share, I wanted to share some photos from Kurt's interviews and introduce now Kurt, Larissa, and Johanna. So let me just share my screen with you. Yeah. So Kurt Marx was born in Cologne in 1925. He lived in the Wittekenstraße 7 in Köln-Sülz and attended the Jewish Jaffna gymnasium. It's actually, sorry, here are the pictures. And here you can see Kurt, you can see yourself. So this is Kurt in front of his house. There's a picture in the middle of Kurt in his school in the Jaffna, one with his mother in the garden, and one with his 3 friends celebrating Cologne Carnival, and one with his father walking in Cologne. Now, Kurt was put on the Kindertransport in January 1939 and stayed first in a hostel in One Minster Road. And you can see the address of One Minster Road here above Kurt's visa. And that hostel was sponsored by Walham Lane Synagogue. After the beginning of the war, he was evacuated to Bedford. And here you can see the correspondence, and Kurt might want to talk about it, between his parents after his arrival. On the left, you can see where it says, you know, Wittekenstraße 7, Köln. And there's a very interesting document here as well. On the right, it's too small to read, but it is the letter written by Dr. Klebansky to the parents. It's on the right of our screen, to the parents of the children, saying, please give us permission so we can take them to England. Kurt met his wife Ingrid, an Auschwitz survivor, at Bar Kochwa in 1955, and they went together for Kurt's work to Tanzania. And you can see a picture of Kurt in Tanzania here on the right, and a picture of their wedding on the screen. Shortly after the birth of his only son, Michael, the family returned to London, where Kurt worked for the Tanzanian government in the diamond industry until he retired. After the war, he tried to find out what had happened to his parents, whose last letter he received in autumn 1942, in which they talked about their impending departure in July 42. Many years later, he found out that they were deported to Minsk and shortly after murdered in the forest of Maly Trostenets, now in Belarus. And here I've put together some of the photos of Kurt in Cologne, looking at the Stolpersteine on the right, in Belarus on the left with the then mayor from Cologne, Kurt in the Jaffna school where the tree is, and he will tell us about it. And here you can see Kurt also with Larissa giving a talk on the bottom left, and with Larissa's children in front of the Kindertransport statue at Liverpool Street Station. So Larissa Schmitz is a political scientist and journalist. She lives in an old house in Cologne, which is home to many families, but most importantly, in front of her house are 4 Stolpersteine. And you can see them at the bottom here, for one murdered family. While searching for the traces of that family who once lived in her house and were deported, Larissa and her family met Kurt Marx, and she's going to tell us about that meeting very shortly. Johanna Marx is Kurt's granddaughter, and she's here on the bottom picture. She lives in London and works in classical music, and she has accompanied Kurt to Cologne together with her father, Michael, in 2017, and has recently organized a session for Limud, talking to Kurt and Larissa about their friendship and her connection to her grandfather's story. So, without further ado, let me ask the first question to Kurt. Kurt, you arrived on the 18th of January, 1939 in the UK, and here we are 83 years later. You have recently received honors from the United Kingdom and Germany for your efforts in Holocaust education. So I want to ask you, how do you feel about this? And please share your memories of leaving Cologne and arriving on the 18th of January in the UK, together with your classmates from the Jaffna school.
Well, actually, I don't think I have to say very much. You've told everybody everything about me, so I know most of what you said. There was only one small mistake. The picture of Africa was not East Africa, for which I worked at Tanzania. This was in West Africa. This was on the Gold Coast. I left London for the Gold Coast, and this was taken after independence in Ghana. So that's the, otherwise I have no complaints.
That's good.
Yes, it's unbelievable that 83 years have gone by. In fact, today is the anniversary that I came here, and that I'm still here to talk about it. It's still quite amazing. I don't think anybody in my family ever became that old, but still we're fighting on and struggling on. And my main concern was to tell people, yes, about my history, which is nothing unusual. It happened. There are many stories like that. But that Maly Trostenets, Minsk, especially Maly Trostenets, nearly 200,000 people were murdered there, and nobody has ever even heard of the place. And this is something I still can't understand how that is possible. For some reason or other, it was kept quiet, or nobody wanted to talk about it, or the Russians wouldn't talk about it. And many people who have mentioned it to Maly Trostenets has never been, nobody has ever even heard of the place. And this is really quite upsetting. So I've tried my little bit to try to get people to know about it, that it is there. And one of the trips one of the last ones, in fact, when the place was completely neglected at one time, and you couldn't find it. Nobody knew where it was. When you did get there, you had to climb across a mountain of rubbish to even get to the place. And it has become now a place of remembrance. A large memorial has been put up, and it was mainly done, to a large extent anyway, by IBB, the educational organization from Dortmund, collected millions of euros, and I'm really very grateful to them mainly that it has actually happened. It was 2 years ago, I think, in 2018, that it was inaugurated, and the German president Steinmeier and Austrian president and the Belarus president, they were actually sitting on the same platform, which I don't think has ever happened before, to be there at that time. And the European journalist, media was there. So it did get a little bit of publicity.
Good, but obviously when you left, you thought that your parents would join you. So tell us a little bit about the circumstances of your leaving and arriving in Britain, please.
Well, the beginnings, life was, for a small boy, was fairly normal. I think the real trouble started after Kristallnacht, on the 10th of November, going to school in the morning. When I got to the Jaffna, it was burning. There was smoke coming out of the school. Quite a commotion. We were told, you better go home. We'll let you know what's going to happen. Even then, I didn't realize there was anything wrong. My uncle was a butcher, a very beautiful, if there is such a thing, butcher shop. And I said, I'll just go down there and say hello. When I get there, it was completely smashed to smithereens, to small pieces. And that's when I got a bit bothered and worried. I went home. I mean, there was no mobile phone in those days. It took me about half an hour, I suppose, on my bicycle to get home, to find out, to tell my parents what had happened. And my father hadn't been home that night. He wasn't at home. A friend of his had warned him, don't be home tonight, there's going to be trouble. So it was all organized. It wasn't spontaneous. And that was the beginning of the real problem for us at school and for the Jewish population in general, who in the meantime, of course, had lost their jobs and lost their work, were forced to sell their business. And that's when Klebansky decided, we must get out of here. Jews can't live in Germany anymore. And this letter that you saw, really, he had not only to convince himself, but also the parents of the children to allow them to come away with the school, because the parents in general wanted their children to be with them. They were protective of their children, and they didn't really understand what was going to happen. Anyway, I'm grateful, that he persevered, and my parents allowed me to come to England. And of course, when we left, it wasn't as if we were running away from something at that stage. It was almost like a holiday. We were going to England, we were going abroad. It was an important trip. And we knew that in a very few weeks' time, we would probably meet up and go to America. That was the plan anyway. Of course, it never happened. We never saw each other again. I did get letters. In the first instance, they used to write to a cousin or an uncle in Holland, who then sent on the letters to me. And later on, once America was in the war, Holland was overrun, we could still send Red Cross messages to each other. And to my regret, I did not write as often as I should have done. At the moment, I'm in the process of translating the letters that I still have when they wrote to me. And there was always, in all the letters, the certainty, the hope that they would soon get their affidavit to go to America and we would be together again. Of course, it's after the Wannsee conference, they were deported. We know the date. The note I've got was written on the 19th of July. They were deported on the 20th of July. The next day, I don't know how my father managed to send a letter the day before. They actually had to pay for the journey to Minsk. And after that last message, nothing. And I had to really wait for 50 years before we actually knew what had actually happened. In fact, the book written by Korbach, where they found the archives of the transports from Cologne, not only to Russia, but to wherever they went to. These archives had been found, and they have been transcribed into the book, which was known, I think, 6 o'clock exit from Köln-Deutz. And that is the first record where we know exactly what happened. So, of course, it took so many years before it was actually known what happened. That was my wish. That's when I went to Maly Trostenets, and it was also very difficult. One couldn't go to Belarus. It was a communist, still is a communist dictatorship. So this was the very beginning, where you see my father with me walking down the Sulzburgstraße in Sülz, and you see me now, 96 years later.
Mm. And could Dr. Erich Klebansky was also killed in Maly Trostenets?
Yes, and his family, his wife and children. He could not save himself. He left it too late. People told him, why don't you stay in England? But he wanted to bring more children to England. And of course, nobody knew that the war broke out as soon as it did. He organized, after the 10th of November, organized his whole excursion or the trip with Kindertransport, via Kindertransport. And by the time it came to August, that means 6-7 months later, it was too late.
Thank you, Kurt. Kurt, just to share with us, what are your first memories of arriving in Britain 83 years ago?
Well, it wasn't a day like today. It wasn't a lovely day. It was wet and cold and very gloomy. It was a really nasty winter's day, I remember, when we did arrive. But then, of course, we were taken to the hostel in Cricklewood. There were about 25 boys. The girls had gone to another hostel in Williston Lane. Yes, we settled in. We were boys together. We all knew each other. So we were not abandoned at that stage. Our evacuation, when at the end of, what was it, in August 1939, when we were evacuated from London into the country, when all school children were sent away, it was a much more difficult evacuation than the one when we came here, because we were on our own then with people. But basically, I've always found, wherever it was, people were unbelievably kind. I wonder whether I would take 2 strange little boys into my home now, having no idea where they were, where they came from, or what their background was, or who they were. And people, they did it. It was quite amazing.
Thank you, Kurt. So I always thought also when I interviewed you that the Jaffna, because you came with your classmate, which is very different for most Kindertransportee, that it helped a little bit at the beginning to be with other children.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. And one of our teachers, he had been a rabbi in Bonn. His name was Dr Seligson. Although he was not the most popular teacher, but he was with us. So we were not left to our own devices. We learned English, we were in the hostel, the local Rabbi Louis Rabinowitz, who was also a great man in his own way, would have been chief rabbi here if he hadn't blotted his copybook at one stage. He would play football with us in the back garden. You know, we were looked after in the early days, and there's no doubt about that. And we were made very welcome.
Thank you, Kurt. Thank you for sharing that glimpse into your history. Larissa, I'd like now to ask you a question, please. You live in Cologne today, and as I said before, in front of your house, there are some Stolpersteine. So please tell us a little bit about what led you to finding Kurt in Cologne, and how has your meeting Kurt changed your life and maybe perception of history? That's a big question, but
yeah. Well, first of all, we were so lucky when we found this apartment. A rent we could afford, enough space for our two daughters. It's a light. It's in this good rooms, nice area, trees in front of the windows. But every day when you walk out the door, you cross these Stolpersteine and you see the four names of a family like ours. Of course, we saw the parallels: mother, daughter, and father.
What are the names, Larissa? What are the names?
The names is Margot and Ruth, that are the daughters, and Walter, and I see it every day, but now I'm kind of speaking to all the people. Lotte Herma, and couple is last name, and relatives of this family is also, they are also watching our talk today, because when we saw the stones, we wanted to know more about the family, and I was thinking about, were they as lucky as we are? How did they look? How were the girls like? Which school did they go? And I had the idea of finding a picture of them, seeing them on a photo. This hasn't happened so far. We were not able, I found relatives, but no photo. And then we did a research about the Stolpersteine, and by this we found out that every Jewish children were forced to go to the same school, which helped us in finding Kurt. And so we just wrote, we didn't write directly to him, because we were thinking about, if we write an email to him and speaking about Stolpersteine in front of our house, a murdered family, maybe it's too close, maybe he doesn't like it. And we found an article that he's taking Yiddish lessons. And so I wrote to Jewish Care, and just, you got it, and a few minutes later you just answered, Kurt, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like, I told the girls, we just got an answer, so what should we write? Yeah, you don't want to make a mistake or so. And but then we spoke, we started the conversation. You wanted to know what the children learn in school about this time, and why we were interested in finding more out, something about the stones. Yeah, and then we realized not only the family couple was killed in Maly Trostenets, your parents too. And it was the 75th anniversary of the murdering. And yeah, we decided maybe he wants to come over. We decided that you want to come over, we decided to invite you. And first of all, you said, nah, I cannot come. I have visitors coming from Germany. But then 5 days ahead of the date, you said, yeah, I'm coming. I'm coming to see you, I'm flying to Cologne. And yeah, then we met, and it was a stranger who planned to come to see us, a stranger where we exchanged mails with. But as you stepped into you went into the door, you sit down, you were sitting on our table, we were watching pictures together, and there was an immediate connection. yeah, it's you cannot describe it. And we all asked questions. We looked at pictures, and the girls really felt close to you. And yeah, so up from that day, we were like friends, or we are friends now. It's, yeah, we were gifted. We looked for the Stolpersteine of the couple family, and we were gifted with a friendship.
Thank you, Larissa. And Kurt, did you know that house? Because this wasn't your house, Larissa's.
No, no, it wasn't my house. Well, it was, about 5 minutes away from where I used to live. And I had an uncle and aunt who lived just around the corner. It is quite unbelievable. Now, I think the one experience which I've never had before, I went to get a flight from Stansted, and there were 2 flights to Cologne at the same time for some reason or other. They were both exactly the same time, 10 minutes to 7 in the morning from Stansted. Both were cheap flights. One was with, I think, German wings, and the other one was one of the English cheap flights. They had the same slot. Well, it can't be the same slot. When I heard them announce 7:10 to Köln-Bonn, I went. When I got finally to the channel, it was the wrong one. So they said, how do I get to the right one? This will take you there. By the time I got there, the channel was closed and I missed a plane. That is the only time I ever missed a plane. Now, I always wondered what Larissa or what they must have thought. There's this old codger coming from London and he misses a plane. Who misses a plane? You can't miss a plane, you know. But so I got another flight to Dortmund. From Dortmund, I took a bus to Cologne. And anyway, that was our first meeting. I think she must have wondered, what is this old man, how does he get around? He can't even get onto the plane. So that was our first experience together.
But since then you have done, Larissa, you organized.
Yes, I still find it quite amazing. In principle, and I must be honest there, I had never thought I would ever have a German friend. That was unthinkable for me. And when I went to Maly Trostenets via this IBB, I was very reluctant to go because it was a German organization. And I must say that all the people who belong to it, who are involved with this, they were all very nice people. I still can't believe it today that this was possible. And yes, and the 2 girls, of course, yes, lovely children. They're not so small anymore. Feline is now, I think she's also watching this.
Yeah, I saw her name too.
I saw her name earlier on. But they're all older now than I was when I came to England. So it's quite an amazing experience for me.
You know what Marlina just said yesterday?
Yes.
Imagine I would have gone to, I would be in school without knowing what Kurt had told me. So this, because knowing Kurt, I came to school and I knew a lot.
Yes, there you are.
And Larissa, you've taken Kurt to schools, or you've organized Kurt going to schools. Tell us what it's like to kind of see that Kurt talking to pupils in Cologne.
Well, that wasn't such a big thing to organize, because my daughters urged me, can we take him to school? Because they both had the feeling that they learned so much. And so, of course, we went to their classes first. And yeah, what is it? The good thing is how Kurt speaks, especially it works with young children. So we also were speaking this autumn with students, elder students, but also children in the age of 10, they have easy questions who are not easy to answer, but you answer it. And there is this kind of connection, because I mean, Kurt is telling about just the things that is happening to these children today as well, like having friends or not having friends, like being separated from friends. But it's also that he's telling them how it was used against him to force him out if you separate children into two groups. I mean, that you just gave them the example, some wear uniforms, some don't. What does it make to you? And you cannot, it's like, or you tell the children, you can survive. Even if you leave your parents with 13, you can survive. And I think this makes a difference, because for the children, Kurt is not, he is of course a victim of history because you lost your parents, but you are not a victim. You are a survivor for the children, and you are someone they can look up to. And also the Klebansky story, this is a hero story, somebody who saved children but wasn't able to save his own family, but still was doing something so good, which is bigger than himself. And I mean, you're only speaking about your life, and you have the connection to the people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Larissa. I think at this point, talking about the younger generation, I'd like to bring in Kurt's granddaughter, Johanna. I would like to ask Johanna, at what point did you become aware of your grandfather's history? And of course, your grandmother was also a Holocaust survivor. And so what was it like to grow up with two grandparents, you know, one who's come as a refugee and one as a survivor? And I also know that you went to one of the trips to Cologne with Kurt and met Larissa. So please tell us about that as well.
So I don't really remember when I was first told about the history of both my grandparents. I know that I somehow always knew about it, but only as kind of an overview, just to know your grandfather came here on the Kindertransport, and your grandmother was a refugee and spent time in Auschwitz. And it wasn't till a bit later, when I went on a course when I was about 11 with the Wiener Library in London. And at home we had quite a lot of books on the subject, but there was no conversation directly with either of my grandparents. And unsurprisingly, with my grandmother Ingrid in particular, I was 7 when she passed away. So it may not have been the right time to speak about that subject, but I don't think there has ever been a direct conversation between me and my grandparents about their experiences. So I've kind of learned as I've gone along, and also from my father, Michael. I remembered that I was given a copy of my grandmother's story, her kind of movements throughout the war and beyond, that Kurt wrote some years ago. So that gave me a good idea without the ability to have that conversation directly. What was it like? It kind of, in terms of my relationship with the two of them, what didn't feel any different to any other grandparents as far as I knew. Obviously now, as I'm older, I can see the effect that their experiences have had on my dad, and therefore how that affected our family as well, for better or worse. But I would say probably the first time that I was able to hear the story kind of from the horse's mouth, as it were, was when I visited Cologne in 2017. So I went with Kurt to visit his hometown. It was the first time that I heard him speak German. I'd never heard that before. It was the first time I'd heard him talk about things from his childhood, different foods that he liked to eat, places that he used to go, the school. Because I had known the story from what I'd been told, but I'd never heard anything from start to finish. So the first time I heard that was when he addressed, I think it was a primary school we went to, and also a talk that he did with Larissa for the IVB. So that's probably my timeline in terms of what I knew, what I didn't know.
And how did it affect you on the trip?
I would say it connected me more on a personal level to what happened, and on an emotional level as well. It was interesting to find out things that I didn't know before, and also because we went to the archives as well, I was able to see photos of family that I had never seen before either. So whilst I knew before in principle what happened, it was at that point that I was able to connect with it visually a bit more on a, yeah, as I say, emotional level as well.
And you know, we're at the stage now where some third generation started talking in schools about their grandparents' stories. Is that something you could see yourself doing in the future? Or you think it's a good thing for next generation to do that?
I don't know, to be honest. It's definitely a story that I'm happy to share. I think Holocaust education kind of really varies depending on the school. Certainly in the school I went to, which is a Jewish school, it was a very emotive topic, understandably. But I think that sometimes clouded the information getting through. So it would be interesting, and to my knowledge, I mean, maybe people would correct me, but I've not had any conversations about how all this has affected me as a third generation survivor with other third generation, I want to say children, but they're all adults now. So it would be interesting to have that conversation at this point with other people to see what they think. Because as much as I think it's important to pass the information on and teach people about what happened, and if people know you, they can connect to the story if they had sort of no direct involvement. But it would be interesting to see how that fits in with current Holocaust education in schools, which I have to confess I don't know on any great detail how that is.
Well, I think there will be more conversation going forward. The AJR, for example, is now just this next generation committee and the activities for second, third generation. And also the archive, Refugee Voices, we have just started interviewing second and third generation. So it will be interesting to look at those interviews in some time and to compare the stories, I think. Thank you so much, Johanna. I wanted to ask Larissa and Courtney again about the Stolpersteine, because Susanne mentioned that it is an amazing project. I checked, I think there are now more than 85,000 Stolpersteine in the whole of Europe. It's the biggest decentralized memorial. And for me, it's very poignant because, you know, I feel I walked on the same streets as Kurt and Larissa. My mother had a practice, I mean, literally 2 minutes from the Syltburger Straße. And there were no Stolpersteine, so there was no reference to any history at all. There was nothing I could read. So I wonder, both Kurt and Larissa, what you feel about this and what you feel about the idea of you know, Holocaust remembrance. Whether is that local aspect very important, or how do you see it in the future? Maybe Larissa, I don't know whether you have some.
Yeah, the thing is that I met Kurt through the Stolpersteine of another family, but Kurt's family has no Stolpersteine, And we met because others looked for the connection to Kurt before. I mean, the old school of Kurt, the Jaffna, there are people working voluntarily for years in the Lern- und Gedenkort Jaffna, and they made the contact. So it's not only that we should look on the Stolpersteine, there are local projects too and volunteers. And the Stolpersteine help a lot if you walk through the streets, but to look at biographies and to make connections, you need to have a deeper relationship, I think, and you have to look behind. It's not only names, it's stories behind it, and this you don't see on the stones. This you have to look for.
Maybe we should mention here that the Jaffna, that organization was actually founded by a non-Jewish couple, Dieter and Irene Korbach, and they started this when I was still in Cologne, and it was an amazing thing. I think, I don't know, it must have been late 80s. And was it Kurt? I don't know.
Yes, something like that, perhaps even earlier.
Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Irene Korbach went to the Lissa Straße, which is a technical college now, and she was a pupil there, and she discovered that Lissa Straße school had been a Jewish school before the war, and she started to inquire. She knew more about the Jewish community that had been in Cologne than anybody else I knew. It's quite amazing. She got really very much involved with this. And she was the one who went to Maly Trostenets at the very early stage, before one could go there. But from the Stolpersteine point of view, yes, I was asked, why don't you do it? And I always was very reluctant from my point of view. It's like walking on somebody's grave. And I just couldn't see myself. I mean, there is one of our family, my grandmother in Pol, who lived outside where she used to live. Today there's a supermarket there, but where the house used to be, my grandparents' house, they had a very large house in Pol. And I don't know who did it, but somebody put the Stolpersteine there of my grandmother, uncle and aunt, and their 3 children. So there is a memorial to the family of sorts. But I always felt that I was very reluctant to do it because it somehow doesn't feel right for me. I don't know why.
It's interesting because, in fact, not all Germans have Stolpersteine. I think the city of Munich, I think the Jewish community was quite against the Stolpersteine for that very reason. So I think there are no Stolpersteine. And then to come up with this idea of stehlen, you know, something on the side.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting. So you are not planning to put anything down for your parents?
I haven't, as yet, I haven't been, I understand what the lady Susanne, what she was saying, that it is all over Germany and it's making an impact. I see it does. And personally, I felt it's like going to a cemetery and walking on the graves, which doesn't seem right for me. But it's a very personal thing.
Kurt, I wanted to ask you of your visits going back to Cologne and talking to children. What was the most moving thing for you, and how important was it to reconnect with Cologne?
With Cologne, I don't know. I have mixed feelings about Cologne as such. We had a large family in Cologne. I had uncles and aunts and cousins in every part of the town. My grandparents lived there. The family has been in West Germany, I think, for 500 years. We've got records. I've got a family tree a mile long. They always lived there. My talking to the children at school in German, I suppose I speak at their level. My German is still a child's German, so they relate to me when I talk to them. They understand my language. I think we must tell them they must be educated. And I was surprised, and I've spoken to various schools in Germany, that they are being taught about it, and a lot of the children know much more than I expected them to know about that time. And I think very often children learned something from me at the time and took it home. And even the parents hadn't been interested or involved. So we must teach the children, not only in Germany, everywhere. Here in this country as well, the education is not, I don't think, as good as it ought to be. The people who teach it very often, who are given the task to teach in the schools here, as it's part of the curriculum, I don't think some of the teachers are very interested in the subject and know even less about it. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. But unfortunately, those that have actually experienced it, whether they are survivors or Kindertransport, or we're all survivors of sorts, whether there'll be any left to tell the story. That most of them are now in their 90s or older even. So before long, it will be the second and third generation who have to talk about it. And I hope it will not be forgotten.
And Kurt, what do you feel about it, the second and third generation talking? Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, yes, if they don't, nobody else will. So I think it should be, it has to be done by them, because otherwise the world as such, they have other problems, and that's not one of them. And anti-Semitism, as was mentioned before, is becoming more popular, if that is the thing to say. But I don't understand why. They have nothing better to do to hate or dislike. I think it's a hatred that is inborn, and it is very sad, in fact, to think that after all this, that anti-Semitism should become popular again. If among in a certain group, whether it's the left wing or the right wing, it's difficult for me to understand why it should be happening again.
Thanks, good. So the second and third generation has to take on the baton. Larissa, I asked you in one of our correspondence, what for you was the most memorable event or meeting with Kurt? And maybe what you told me was very poignant. Please share that with all of us.
What exactly do you mean? Because
it was about going to the archives.
Ah, yes.
With grandson, because
yes, that was in 2019 when we went to the archives in Cologne. I don't think that it was so. For me, it was one of the most memorable moments. But I don't think that you realized it, Kurt and Daniel, because we were looking. They did show us the Geburtsurkunde. What does it mean in English?
Birthday honors?
Yeah, the birth certificate. Birth certificate of your father, Sigmund.
Right.
And it was like you could see the date when he was born, you could see where he was born, and there were stamps on the side. And one stamp was from 1939 that by law, your father took the second name Israel. It was with a stamp. And then there was a second stamp that sometimes in the 1950s, that by law, this name is taken away again, and that he has his real name like before and not longer Israel. And for me, in that moment, when I saw these two stamps, like I felt like so ashamed. The power of bureaucracy, just putting a stamp, somebody has another name, and then, I mean, he was murdered. He was murdered with the help of bureaucracy. And then in 1950, you put another stamp like, huh, yeah, everything like before, as if you can do something, put in order again. Can we say like this? Es ist nicht in Ordnung. That was something like, you were looking at the birth certificate and I was like, oh, this is my country, like I'm very ashamed for. Yeah, and that was my moment, which I would have felt full. I don't think that I would have realized it without knowing you, because that was when I realized I have a different point of view now. I'm yeah, I'm missing words.
Thank you, Larissa, for sharing this. And I know exactly what you mean, because sometimes when you go to Dachau or to the museum and you see the letters written by the people who work there, the bureaucracy, it's just unbelievable and shocking, you know. It's not related to the content, it's just a sort of bureaucracy.
Yeah, and it's my country. So I'm a part of it. And yeah. I like this country. I like to live here and I have to live with the history, but it's not only history. It's like that was in the 1950s, and in a way it's going on. If the people don't realize what is, they think, this is the other thing with the Stolpersteine, for example, something, yeah, it's history. We think about history, but it's also present, because the third and second generation, they have to deal with it still.
Thanks, Larissa. Kurt, do you remember that at all, that instant in the archive?
I know Larissa told me about it. It didn't, I mean, I saw it as well, that they had given him the name because he was a Jew. And now, that was, all right, that was the Nazi period. Yet, at a later stage, as Larissa said, the Democrats, or not the Democrats, the authorities decided, now that everything is fine again, we can take that identification away again. We don't need it anymore. They don't have to be a name plus Israel to identify him as a Jew. He can become a normal memory. Well, of course, that is something you can't erase it. You can't say it didn't exist. It did exist. And there is something very callous about it. But at the same time, I found that the people I met, put it that way, I only seem to meet nice people, but they're not all nice people, I'm quite sure. And in certain parts of Germany, you've got a very right wing, I don't know whether you call them, they call what they call them now, they don't call them Nazis anymore, they call them, I don't know what. But there's still quite a large number of people who are sorry that Hitler didn't finish the job.
Thank you, Kurt. I'd like to open the floor soon, but John, I wanted to just have one last question for you about your relationship with Germany today and whether you've taken up Susanne mentioned that the offer of citizenship and what you think about it.
I have taken up citizenship, to answer that question first, and that was confirmed for me and also my brother and my dad as well earlier last year. How do I feel about the country itself? I haven't spent very much time there to feel a type of way about the place. I would say that I have the connection to it via the trip that I went on with my grandfather and via Larissa as well. But there is still a discomfort there. But I would say that having a connection to it has also allowed me to find out more about my past and my grandparents' past. So it's kind of a very mixed feeling.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You see, I think that fits into, in a way, this theme of one day, because we looked at today at one day of Kurt's arrival, but it's also obviously for the future. And we don't know one day, you know, how you're going to feel about Germany, and one day how we are all going to, how, you know, Holocaust education is going to change, and, you know, what memorials we have to create so that this history is being remembered. So just, have you got anything else, Kurt or Larissa or Joe, at this point? Otherwise, I would like to invite questions. Have you got anything at this point to add? Something I haven't asked you, Kurt or Larissa or Joe?
How many hours do we have?
No, I think we're still okay. If there's something important, I'm looking, let's look otherwise for some questions. Wave or put a text in.
I've just sent you a couple of questions that have come in on chat.
Thank you, Susan. So yeah, so you have a message from somebody who worked on the issue of citizenship and is happy that you have taken on the citizenship, and says, you know, people will be pleased to hear that the offer was taken up. I can't see anything else at the moment.
That's the only question I've had so far on chat.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions? You can wave, or Michael Newman has a question.
Well, since our members are amazingly shy today, I thought I would ask a question. Larissa, the Stolpersteine in Cologne, are school children taught about them, and do they go and visit them?
Yeah, I mean, you should not, there's no reason not to talk about it, because the children ask their parents. Even, I mean, when they start to learn, I saw it to read in school. I saw it quite often. Then they sit down on the ground, and then they like do like the names, for example, in front of our house. Lotte, Walter. And in the second class, then they can read the word ermordet, which means murdered. So of course they ask, and then you tell them, and some of them you tell earlier because of the Stolpersteine.
So there's an interaction anyway as part of the sort of fabric of society.
Yeah,
so
but not only because of the Stolpersteine. It's also, I mean, for example, with my youngest daughter, when she was 5, it was Holocaust Memorial Day, and I put her up I took her from kindergarten, and then the radio was, the radio news were talking about industrial killing of humans. And she asked me, what is industrial killing of humans? Then you have to explain it. And she was 5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a question. Is that, Michael, anything else, or?
I mean, yes, but we're happy to let others carry on. So.
Okay, one question is about Maly Trostenets. Kurt, how you think it should, that, you know, how can we increase awareness? And I'm also, of course, aware that Jackie Young is with us today, whose mother was also murdered in Maly Trostenets, you know, and the question is, how can we increase awareness? But also, you know, I would say also the story of Erich Klebansky. Not so many people in England know his name at all.
No, they don't. Klebansky's name is also not known here. With Maly Trostenets, that it is not known, I don't know why. People haven't heard of it. Nobody seems to have heard of it. But I spoke to a school in Maly Trostenets, strangely enough, which is fairly close to the area. And there also the children are taught about it. They are taught now what happened there, but that is mainly due to IBB, who have done a lot of educational work over there. Unless people teach the children, the older people, well, they're old now, don't talk about it. Obviously, people might say they might have been involved, but those people are mainly not there anymore. But other people don't want to talk about it. It's not a nice subject to talk about. So that it takes 2 or 3 generations before people will even mention it. And that's why my generation didn't tell our children and grandchildren. Somehow we are all very protective, and we don't want to burden children with a subject which is not only very pleasant, it's traumatic to think that my son did not grow up with any grandchildren, with any grandparents. Yes, there was one uncle, but in general, there's something missing in their lives. And the parents are very conscious of that. And then very often one has been blamed, why didn't you tell us? But it's not a very nice thing to have to talk about, that all your family has been murdered in horrendous ways. It took, I think, about 65 years before people started to talk about Kindertransport here. A few years ago, if you mention Kindertransport, they look at you, they've never even heard anybody mention it. So it takes perhaps 2 or 3 generations before it becomes talked about. And by that time, most of the people who were involved are not alive anymore, or are very, very close to the end of their lives.
Thank you, Kurt. I have one question here saying thank you for this moving session to all of you. But you mentioned that you're translating your letters of your parents, and whether you wanted to share some of the advice they gave you.
Advice they gave me? They didn't give me advice. They were very concerned whether my underwear still fitted, whether I had enough socks to wear, whether my shoes were still big enough. That was their concern. Was I coping with the physical things that I needed? Not very long ago, one of my old school friends, also from Cologne, his correspondence with his father was discovered. Not only what the father wrote to him, but also what he wrote to the father. I never quite fathomed how they got his letters. They must have been kept by somebody in Cologne. And whatever letters he got, I got the same letters. Why don't you tell us what you're doing? Do you get enough to eat? Are you warm enough? Are the people kind to you? Thank the people for looking after you. It was almost identical to their concern about the most precious thing they owned, or their children, their small child who had gone, and they had no input, and they didn't know what was happening. And the children, the boys especially apparently, wrote even less than the girls. And the parents who were left behind were in touch with each other, and they compared notes, what happened to theirs and what happened to so between all the different little bits of information they got, they had an idea what was happening to us here. And of course, then correspondence didn't carry on anymore. And that's how it was. And then they were deported, and that was it.
Thank you, Kurt, for sharing this with us. There's a question from Catherine Piran from the Jewish Museum in Dorsten. Catherine, are you unmuted? You can ask a question.
Well, thank you everybody for this wonderful session. Bea has already told you that Kurt's story will also be told in our museum in our next exhibition about Kindertransport via the interview that Bea has done. So I'm more, really interested in this story and this context. And I just wanted to ask you about the what other means are there to take the stories forward? Of course, you said, the oral, giving the memory further, giving it to the next generations. The Stolpersteine is also a project. And by the way, it's often school children who research the history behind the people that are on the Stolpersteine. So the older school children, of course, yeah. So I wondered whether other ways of doing it. Of course, exhibitions are also a way of giving the story, telling it again. And I don't know whether you are involved in other projects. I mean, Larissa is a journalist. I don't know whether you work, for instance, in other ways to tell the stories.
What I do is, for example, I did put the couples on genie.com. This is how I met Ellen, who is a member of the couple family who is on the Stolpersteine. And so we made a connection, and now we are in email exchange. And and sometimes I go to archives, and if I find an interesting document, I do research, and then I can write something about it. But I always try to make a connection from the past to the present, because I fear very much that there are still some people that say it happened, it's all over now, and it's good. And so this is why I think we always have to find relatives who live now or traces of the families and the individuals.
I think something we haven't discussed at all is, social media and the power of social media to tell stories. And we at Refugee Voices, we are telling some stories on social media, and it's amazing how many people it reaches. There's one thing for me very important, that we have the whole interview, but also that we can tell some stories in that way. For example, a few days ago, we posted something for Holocaust Memorial Day, where the parents were killed in Novi Sad in Poland, and the city of Novi Sad picked it up and retweeted that, which is amazing. They would have that information managed to get to that point. But there are some more questions. So, Kurt, a comment from you, from a lady saying, could you make the lady proud to be Jewish?
I'm sorry, I've lost you.
Oh, did you hear what I said, Kurt?
Barely.
Shall I repeat it? A lady said that you make her proud to be Jewish. Ah, he's gone. We've lost Kurt now. Okay.
I think his connection dropped out. I'll see whether he comes back in, Bea.
Okay, let's hope, because I had one last question for him. Because
I think he'll probably dial back in. That's what I would think. That's what he'd do. Because
I think what's on everyone's mind is, his advice of being 96 and how one gets to that point. I had a few questions. There is a question from Gabi Glassman to Larissa. Larissa, what do you think, once the first generation isn't there anymore to tell the story, what do you think, how can we continue telling the story?
You can tell stories if you ask. And then you have to look for signs and to follow signs. So I can give you an example. Once I found an old earring. What is the name for it? A ring. wedding ring in an archive. And it was an archive for people who have been in concentration camps. And I wanted to know who was the person behind it. And I found out that there was a daughter living that had no clue what happened to her father. And then she got the ring, the wedding ring, and then she started to talk. So we can always make a connection, but we have to go through the world to look, to listen, and then ask.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions from anyone while Kurt is hopefully managing to join us? I don't know.
Bea,
Yeah.
there's someone called George with his hand up.
Okay, George, can we unmute George, please? George, are you unmuted?
Just asking him to unmute there.
Yeah, I can't actually see him.
I can see his hand waving, but George, you have to unmute to ask your question. I can't unmute him unless he unmutes himself.
George, you have to go to the little icon and press it. In the meantime, Larissa, I wondered, has Dr. Klebansky's niece joined us? Can you see her name? Or if you have joined us, can you please identify?
I'm unmuted now.
Ah, George is unmuted. Okay.
Yes, the normal way didn't work out, to do a different way. Anyway, it's going back to Maly Trostenets. My understanding was that a majority of people who were murdered were actually from Austria in Maly Trostenets. And certainly there were a very large number of transports, particularly later on in the war, going from Vienna to Maly Trostenets. 2 of my aunts were murdered there. And one reason why maybe it's not as well known as it should be is Austrians were very much slower than the Germans in acknowledging what has happened. It's only last year that a full-scale memorial was put up in Vienna, commemorating the very large number, 200,000 Jews who were, well, 60,000 since the beginning of the war, who were murdered. And the Austrian government, now it has acknowledged what has happened. Maybe there will be more publicity. A friend of mine who also gave talks in schools, Otto Deutsch, his parents were murdered in Maly Trostenets, and he was one of those who contributed to the memorial itself. Sadly, he's no longer around. But I think it could well be that because Austria was slow in recognizing what has happened, that fate of Jews who were sent to Maly Trostenets didn't give the same amount of publicity. Mm-hmm. But I very much hope it does get more.
Thank you, George. And I should add that we have Otto Deutsch is in our archive with a wonderful interview. And he talks about his parents and he talks about Maly Trostenets.
He's a wonderful person. He was a wonderful person. Yes.
Yeah, from Southend. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Wonderful interview.
Yes. And thank you very much, Kurt, and well, all of you. I think it's been a very, very moving session. And it's very encouraging that there are so many people in Germany now who are very sincere and fully recognizing what's happened and doing something about it. So very many thanks to everybody who took part in this program.
Thank you so much, George. Kurt is coming back. I'm very happy about that. And also Jackie Young said that he went to Minsk with Otto Deutsch. Jackie, I wonder whether you would like to say something. Hello, Kurt, welcome back. You missed just a little bit. Jackie, do you want to unmute yourself and say something? not set up properly.
I'm just asked Jackie to unmute, and I'm just finding Kurt, who.
Hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Jackie. Where are you? Oh.
Yeah, I went originally quite early to Maly Trostenets with my wife when Margaret Thatcher was the one that actually opened the door to allow me to go. The Russians said, no, you can't come. I got in touch with Margaret Thatcher, and in a couple of weeks, I got the okay to go back to Maly Trostenets. That was when, like, Kurt just said, it was a pile of grass and heap. It was nothing. But I went with the official opening with the obelisk, new obelisk in Maly Trostenets, where 65,000 Jews went there from Vienna. I was born in Vienna, as you know, and there was the president of Belarus plus the Chancellor Sebastian Kurz there as well, amongst an awful lot of other people. I'm pleased to say Hannah Lessinger, who is one of the main people in Vienna, was there as well with us. It was a very moving meeting there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Jackie. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Kurt's back on, Bea, he's unmuted, yeah.
Great, Kurt. So I think it's time for us to bring this session to an end. And I really wanted to thank everyone for attending, and Larissa and Johanna and Kurt, of course, for speaking. And thank you, Susanne Frane from the German.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Kurt. And I've got one last question for you.
There was just one, the gentleman who spoke just now, he said there were 65,000 people murdered, Jews murdered there. One of the priests of the Russian Catholic Church told me, he says, we don't know really how many people were murdered there, but we've got mountains of ashes, which is very difficult to judge how many people actually were burnt there. And this is very questionable numbers who actually lost their lives. It was perhaps a minimum of 60,000, but the maximum we will never know. That's all I wanted to say about that.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. Susan, I can't see Kurt at the moment. Do we need to pin him? Or Susan, are you still here?
I can see me.
Okay, that's better. Now we can see you, Kurt. It's that is a very sad story about Maly Trostenets. But what I was going to ask you, my last question is whether you've got a message for us on this Holocaust Memorial Day 2022. And also after 2 years of the COVID epidemic, I wanted to ask you what kept you going, and what's the best way to combat racism and anti-Semitism?
What kept me going?
Yeah, what kept you going? That's the most important question.
I have breakfast in the morning and keep my fingers crossed. I have no solution of how to keep going. You just have to be lucky, and if life is kind to you, you hang on a bit longer. But answers I don't know. But as far as the rest is concerned, one realizes that if people need help, one should give it to them. There are so many people now who are being persecuted and prosecuted, and the hatred that is being talked about, and I don't know the answer to it, but I think we must educate our children to realize that whether it's whatever color or background or whatever you are, I think we have to live together and try to live together in peace and not be jealous of other people's successes or non-success. the answer is with the politicians. I don't know, they can't agree with each other either at any time. And we just have to try and do our little bit, whatever we can, to help people, because I've experienced receiving help when I first came here, when I went to school, when I was evacuated. People who are kind reap the benefit, I suppose, in the end, in any case. But one doesn't. People ask me, do you hate the Germans? Hate is a terrible thing. You eat yourself up with it. And I found that the majority of people are decent people anyway. They're sometimes pushed along by events, persuaded by others to do whatever they do. But yes, be kind, be helpful. And that's all I can suggest. And educate, of course. That's most important.
Thank you, Kurt, and for these poignant words on this Holocaust Memorial Day. And I'd like to say that I think it's an inspiration to see how Larissa and you have worked together, call it memory work, and are carrying this, to the future, carrying your history into the future. And also your granddaughter who could come and, is also so interested in this story. So I think that's for all of us very, very inspiring, and will make us think how to, carry Holocaust education into the future. So thank you very much again. Thank you, all the audience. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for being with us today. And this, I know Holocaust Memorial Day is really, next week, so there'll be lots of events. So hope to see you again and have a good evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.